The morning mist hung heavy over Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic for the final time. 23 years of military service had taught him the importance of precision, and today would be no different. The brass buttons gleamed under the pale London sun, each one polished to perfection the night before. His black bearskin hat sat firmly on his head, adding nearly a foot to his already imposing 6-foot frame. James had been selected for the Queen's Guard 3 years ago, a position he considered the pinnacle of his career. The role demanded absolute stillness, unwavering focus, and complete dedication to duty. Tourists would gather daily, cameras clicking, trying desperately to make the guards break their stoic composure. Children would wave, adults would make faces, and some would even try to touch the guards, but James had mastered the art of remaining motionless. His colleagues often joked about the strange requests they encountered. Last week, Guard Thompson had a tourist ask him to pose for a selfie. The week before, Guard Williams had someone try to feed him a sandwich. But James took pride in his ability to remain perfectly still, a living statue representing centuries of British military tradition. As he walked toward his designated post outside the palace gates, James reflected on his journey to this moment. Growing up in a small Yorkshire town, he had dreamed of serving his country. His father, a former Navy man, had instilled in him the values of honor, duty, and service. The military had given James purpose, structure, and a sense of belonging he had never found elsewhere. The cobblestones beneath his polished boots echoed with each measured step. Other guards were already taking their positions, their faces set in the familiar expression of professional detachment. The changing of the guard ceremony had concluded an hour earlier, and now began the long hours of standing watch. James reached his post and assumed the position. Feet slightly apart, rifle held at the correct angle, eyes fixed straight ahead. The transformation was complete. Sergeant James Morrison, the man who enjoyed cricket matches and Sunday roasts with his elderly mother, disappeared behind the uniform. In his place stood a symbol of British military excellence. The first tourists began to gather as the morning progressed. Families with excited children, elderly couples with guidebooks, and groups of friends taking countless photos. James could see them in his peripheral vision, but his training kept his gaze fixed forward. Comments floated through the air in various languages, some admiring, others curious, a few attempting humor. A group of American tourists approached, their guide explaining the significance of the Queen's Guard. James listened as the guide recounted the history of the regiment, the training required, and the discipline expected. The tourists seemed genuinely interested, asking thoughtful questions about the traditions and ceremonies. As the morning wore on, the crowd grew larger. Street performers set up nearby, adding to the festive atmosphere around the palace. The sound of accordion music mixed with chatter and laughter, creating the familiar symphony of tourist London. James remained focused, his breathing steady, his posture perfect. Near midday, something caught his attention. A small figure had broken away from a family group and was walking directly toward him. James maintained his forward gaze but could sense the approaching presence. This was not uncommon. Children were often drawn to the colorful uniforms and impressive bearing of the guards. The footsteps stopped directly in front of him. James could see a small girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes. She wore a pink dress and clutched a small stuffed animal. Her parents were several feet away, watching nervously but allowing her this moment of curiosity. The little girl stood there for several moments, studying James with the intense focus only children possess. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to understand this tall, still figure before her. James could feel her gaze, innocent and wondering, but he maintained his position. What happened next would challenge everything James thought he knew about duty, protocol, and the balance between military discipline and human compassion. The little girl stepped closer, her small shoes making barely a whisper against the stone ground. James could smell the faint scent of strawberry from her hair, probably from children's shampoo. Her stuffed rabbit, worn from countless hugs, dangled from her tiny hand. She looked up at him with the kind of pure curiosity that adults lose somewhere along their journey through life. "Mommy says you're a soldier," she whispered, her voice so soft that only James could hear. Her accent carried hints of Yorkshire, reminding him unexpectedly of his own childhood. "Are you protecting the Queen?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. James felt something stir inside him, a warmth he had not expected. His training screamed at him to remain silent, to maintain the perfect stillness that had become second nature. But there was something about this child's genuine interest that touched a part of him he had forgotten existed. Behind her, the girl's parents watched nervously. Her mother, a woman in her 30s with the same blonde curls, held the hand of a younger boy who appeared to be her brother. The father, tall and thin with kind eyes, seemed ready to intervene if necessary, but was clearly giving his daughter the space to satisfy her curiosity. The girl took another small step forward. James could see her more clearly now without moving his eyes. She had a small gap between her front teeth and a sprinkle of freckles across her nose. Her blue dress had tiny flowers embroidered on the collar, and her white socks had slipped down slightly into her black Mary Jane shoes. "My daddy was a soldier too," she continued in her hushed tone. "He had to go away sometimes, but he always came back. Do you have a little girl like me?" The question struck James like a physical blow. He did not have children, had never married, had dedicated his life entirely to his military career. But suddenly, standing there in his rigid uniform, he found himself imagining what it might be like to have a daughter who looked up at him with such trust and admiration. The crowd around them began to take notice of the interaction. Cameras started clicking more frequently. Phones were raised to record videos. James could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages, all focused on the small drama unfolding before his post. The girl reached into a small purse that hung from her shoulder and pulled out something wrapped in colorful tissue paper. "I made this for you," she said, holding it up toward him. "Mummy helped, but I did most of it myself." James could see it was some sort of craft project, perhaps made at school or during a family activity. The tissue paper was bright yellow with red hearts crinkling softly in the gentle breeze. The offering was held up with such innocent generosity that James felt his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Lucy, sweetheart, come back here," her mother called gently. But there was no urgency in her voice. She seemed to understand that something special was happening, something that should not be interrupted. The little girl ignored her mother's call, her attention completely focused on the tall guard before her. "It's okay if you can't talk," she said, lowering her voice even more. "Daddy told me that sometimes soldiers have to be very quiet and very still. But I wanted you to know that I think you're very brave." The sincerity in her words was overwhelming. James had received commendations from superior officers, had been praised for his dedication and professionalism, but never had such simple words carried such weight. This child, who knew nothing about military protocol or royal traditions, had somehow seen past the uniform to recognize something fundamental about service and sacrifice. A small crowd had gathered to watch the exchange. Some tourists were clearly moved by what they were witnessing. Others seemed merely curious about this break in the usual routine. James could hear someone explaining to their companion that the guards never speak or move during their duty, making this interaction all the more remarkable. The girl waited patiently, her gift still extended toward James. Her expression showed no disappointment at his lack of response, only a quiet determination to complete her mission. She seemed to understand, with the wisdom that children sometimes possess, that some gifts are given not for the response they generate, but for the giving itself. Time seemed suspended in that moment. The sounds of the city continued around them, but there in front of Buckingham Palace, a small girl and a Queen's Guard existed in their own bubble of connection. James found himself at a crossroads between duty and humanity, between the rigid demands of his role and the simple request for acknowledgement from an innocent child. What he chose to do next would surprise everyone watching, including himself. James felt his heart racing beneath his immaculate red tunic. 23 years of military training warred against something deeper, something more human. The little girl continued to hold her handmade gift up toward him, her small arms beginning to show signs of fatigue, but her determination unwavering. Her bright blue eyes held such hope and kindness that James felt something fundamental shifting inside him. The crowd around them had grown larger, sensing that something unusual was happening. Phones were held high, recording every moment of this unexpected encounter. James could hear whispered conversations in different languages, all speculating about what the guard would do. Some tourists seemed to be holding their breath as if they too understood the significance of this moment. Fighting every instinct drilled into him during years of service, James allowed his eyes to shift downward, just slightly, to meet the child's gaze. It was the smallest movement, nearly imperceptible to most observers, but the little girl noticed immediately. Her face lit up with a smile so radiant it seemed to illuminate the gray London morning. "You can see me," she whispered with delight. "I knew you could." The simple acknowledgement was enough for her. She carefully placed her wrapped gift at his feet, arranging it with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred ritual. The yellow tissue paper with red hearts stood out brightly against the dark stones, a splash of childhood joy in the formal setting of the palace grounds. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Now you have something to remind you that someone thinks you're special." James felt moisture gathering in his eyes, something that had not happened since his father's funeral 5 years earlier. This child, this complete stranger, had somehow reached past all his defenses and touched something he thought he had buried forever. Her innocence and generosity were overwhelming in their purity. The girl's mother approached slowly, clearly moved by what she had witnessed. "Lucy," she said softly, "we should let the nice soldier get back to his work." But Lucy was not quite finished. She looked up at James again, studying his face with the intensity only children possess. "Are you sad?" she asked. "You look a little bit sad. My mummy says soldiers sometimes get sad because they miss their families." The question nearly broke James's composure entirely. He was sad, he realized. He had been sad for years without even acknowledging it. The military had given him purpose and structure, but somewhere along the way he had forgotten how to connect with the simple joys of human existence. This little girl had seen what his colleagues, his superiors, and even he himself had missed. Gentle breeze picked up, ruffling the tissue paper of the gift and causing Lucy's blonde curls to dance around her face. She reached out then, without warning or hesitation, and wrapped her small arms around James's legs in the tightest hug her little body could manage. The crowd went completely silent. This was unprecedented. Royal guards simply did not interact with the public in this way. James could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, could sense the cameras capturing every second of this moment. His training screamed at him to step back, to maintain protocol, to preserve the dignity of his position. Instead, something extraordinary happened. James felt his rigid posture soften just slightly. His hand, trained to grip his rifle with unwavering steadiness, began to move almost without his conscious permission. Slowly, carefully, he lowered it to rest gently on Lucy's small head, his fingers barely touching her soft curls. The gesture was so subtle that many in the crowd missed it entirely. But Lucy felt it, and her mother saw it, and the few observant tourists who caught the moment seemed to understand they were witnessing something truly special. It lasted only a few seconds, but in those seconds, Sergeant James Morrison allowed his humanity to shine through his uniform. Lucy squeezed tighter, her face pressed against the red fabric of his tunic. "Thank you for keeping us safe," she murmured. Her words muffled but clear enough for James to hear. When she finally released him and stepped back, her smile was even brighter than before. She gave him a small wave, picked up her stuffed rabbit, and skipped back to her parents. Her mother's eyes were glistening with tears, and even her father seemed moved by what they had witnessed. James slowly resumed his rigid posture, his hand returning to its proper position on his rifle. But something had changed. The gift remained, at his feet, a colorful reminder of an unexpected connection. He continued to stare straight ahead, but now his stillness felt different, less like a wall, and more like a choice to hold something precious safe inside. The crowd began to disperse, gradually many wiping away tears of their own. But the impact of what had happened would ripple outward in ways James could never have imagined. The afternoon sun climbed higher over London as James continued his watch, but everything felt different now. The colorful gift at his feet seemed to radiate warmth, drawing occasional glances from passing tourists who had not witnessed the earlier exchange. Some stopped to take photos of the unusual sight, clearly puzzled by the presence of what appeared to be a child's craft project beside the stoic guard. Word of the encounter had begun to spread through the crowd in the way that remarkable moments do. Tourists who had witnessed Lucy's hug shared the story with newcomers, their voices filled with wonder and emotion. James could hear fragments of conversations in multiple languages, all centered around the brief but powerful interaction between the little girl and the Queen's Guard. "Did you see how gently he touched her head?" one American woman whispered to her companion. "I got chills watching it." 20 years I've been coming here," an elderly British gentleman told his wife. "And I've never seen anything like that." That little one saw right through to the man beneath the uniform. James found himself fighting a smile, something that would have been unthinkable just hours before. The rigid mask he had worn for 3 years felt looser somehow, as if Lucy's innocent trust had given him permission to be human again. He maintained his position perfectly, but internally, he felt as though he was awakening from a long, dreamless sleep. A tour guide approached with a new group, and James heard him explaining the significance of the Queen's Guard to the assembled visitors. But this guide had clearly heard about the morning's events because he added something James had never heard before. "These men are not just ceremonial figures," the guide said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "They are real soldiers who have served in conflicts around the world. Behind every uniform is a person who has chosen to dedicate their life to service and duty. Sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we get to see glimpses of the man behind the soldier." The words resonated deeply with James. For 3 years he had felt like he was disappearing behind the uniform, becoming nothing more than a tourist attraction. But Lucy had seen him, really seen him, and somehow that had made all the difference. As the afternoon progressed, James noticed something unexpected happening. Other children in the crowd seemed emboldened by Lucy's example, though none approached quite as closely. A little boy waved shyly from several feet away. A girl about Lucy's age pointed him out to her grandmother, saying something that made the elderly woman smile warmly. It was as if Lucy's fearless display of affection had reminded everyone that the guards were not just ornamental fixtures, but real people worthy of recognition and respect. The atmosphere around his post felt warmer, more connected, less like a museum exhibit and more like a community. Near 3 o'clock, as James was calculating how much longer remained in his shift, he spotted a familiar figure approaching. Lucy had returned, this time holding her mother's hand firmly and practically bouncing with excitement. In her other hand, she clutched what appeared to be a folded piece of paper. "Is that him, Mummy?" James heard her ask as they drew nearer. "The soldier friend I told you about?" Her mother smiled and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, that's him, but remember what we talked about. He's working, so we can't stay long." Lucy approached his post again, this time with slightly more caution, but no less enthusiasm. She had changed clothes since the morning, now wearing a bright red sweater that almost matched James's tunic and carrying a different stuffed animal, this one a small teddy bear wearing a miniature soldier's uniform. "Hello again," she said in her soft voice, just loud enough for James to hear. "I brought you something else, and I brought my brother Tom to meet you too." James could see the younger boy hanging back slightly, perhaps 5 years old, with darker hair than his sister, but the same bright, curious eyes. Tom clutched his mother's other hand and peered at James with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Lucy carefully unfolded the paper she had been carrying and held it up. It was a drawing, clearly created with crayons and marked by the wonderful imperfection of child's artwork. James could make out a figure in red with a tall black hat, standing next to what appeared to be a palace with the Union Jack flying overhead. In the corner, a small figure with yellow hair and a pink dress stood next to the soldier, both figures smiling broadly. "I drew us," Lucy announced proudly. Mummy helped me write your name, but I don't know if it's right because I don't know what you're really called. I wrote my soldier friend instead. The simple title hit James with unexpected force. In all, his years of military service through multiple deployments and countless ceremonies, he had been called many things: sergeant, soldier, sir, guard, but never had any title carried the weight of genuine affection that those three words held. The drawing showed such care and attention to detail that James found himself studying every crayon stroke. Lucy had even attempted to draw the buttons on his uniform and the plume on his bearskin hat. But most remarkably, she had drawn both figures with enormous smiles, capturing the joy of their brief connection in a way that no photograph ever could. Tom finally gathered his courage and stepped forward slightly. "Lucy says you're the bravest soldier in the whole world," he announced in the matter-of-fact way that children state what they believe to be absolute truth. The innocence and sincerity of both children created a moment of such pure human connection that James felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack once again. James felt something break open inside his chest as he looked down at Tom's earnest face. The little boy had clearly worked up considerable courage to speak to the imposing guard, and his declaration carried the absolute certainty that only children possess. Through his peripheral vision, James could see Lucy beaming with pride at her brother's bravery. The drawing Lucy held was already becoming precious to him, though he could not reach for it while on duty. The stick figures rendered in bright crayon somehow captured more truth about their encounter than any official photograph ever could. She had drawn them as friends, as equals, despite the obvious differences in their size, age, and station. "Can I hug him again, Mummy?" Lucy asked, but this time she directed the question to James as well. "Is it okay if I hug you again, soldier, friend?" The direct question put James in an impossible position. Protocol demanded he remain completely still and silent, but this child was asking his permission, treating him not as a tourist attraction, but as a person whose consent mattered. Her respect for his humanity, even while he stood in his official capacity, moved him profoundly. Around them, a small crowd had gathered again. Word was clearly spreading about the morning's encounter and Lucy's return. James could see people holding up phones ready to capture whatever happened next. But he also noticed something different in the crowd's energy. Instead of the usual carnival atmosphere of tourists trying to provoke a reaction, there was a reverence, an understanding that they were witnessing something genuinely special. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd whispered to her companion, "That little girl has done something remarkable. Look at how different he seems even while standing so still." She was right. James could feel the difference in himself. The rigid armor he had worn for 3 years had developed cracks, allowing warmth and connection to seep through. He was still every inch the professional soldier, still maintaining his post with perfect discipline, but now his stillness felt alive with possibility rather than dead with routine. Lucy waited patiently for some sign of acknowledgement, her drawing still held high for him to see. Tom watched his sister with obvious admiration, clearly impressed by her courage in approaching the towering guard. Their mother stood quietly behind them, tears glistening in her eyes as she watched her children offer such pure affection to a stranger. Then James did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Maintaining his forward gaze, he took a single, deliberate step backward. It was the smallest movement, barely noticeable to casual observers, but it created just enough space for Lucy to approach without interfering with his official duties. The crowd recognized the significance of the gesture immediately. This was not a break in protocol, but rather a graceful accommodation that honored both his military obligations and the child's sincere request. Cameras clicked and phones recorded as Lucy understood the invitation and stepped forward. Her second hug was even more meaningful than the first. She wrapped her arms around his legs again, but this time she seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening. She held on a little longer, a little tighter, as if trying to transfer some of her boundless affection into the serious man who had somehow captured her heart. James felt his hand move again, this time with more certainty. He placed it gently on her head, allowing his fingers to briefly smooth her soft curls. The gesture was tender, protective, paternal in a way that stirred emotions he had never experienced before. "Thank you for being so brave," Lucy whispered, against his uniform. "And for keeping everyone safe, even me." When she stepped back, she carefully placed the drawing at his feet next to her earlier gift. The colorful paper fluttered slightly in the afternoon breeze, but it remained secure against the stone. She then motioned for Tom to come forward. Tom approached shyly, but with determination. Instead of attempting a hug, he simply saluted James, with the serious concentration of a 5-year-old mimicking what he had seen in movies. The gesture was imperfect but heartfelt, and James felt his throat tighten with emotion. Unable to return the salute while on duty, James instead offered the smallest nod of acknowledgement, a gesture so subtle that only Tom and those watching very carefully would notice it. But Tom saw it, and his face split into a grin that rivaled his sister's for pure joy. The family began to withdraw then, sensing that they had been given an extraordinary gift and should not overstay their welcome. But as they walked away, Lucy turned back one final time. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she called softly. James could not answer, but somehow his expression must have conveyed something, because Lucy smiled and waved goodbye. As they disappeared into the crowd, James realized that this little girl had not only changed his afternoon, but had fundamentally altered his understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. The gifts at his feet would remain there until the end of his shift, but the impact of Lucy's friendship would last far beyond that. As evening approached and James's shift neared its end, he reflected on the most extraordinary day of his military career. The gifts at his feet had remained throughout the afternoon, drawing questions and smiles from passing tourists. Several people had asked nearby guards about the significance of the items, and word of Lucy's gesture had spread far beyond the palace grounds. When the relief guard arrived for the evening shift, James finally broke his rigid posture. His muscles ached from hours of standing, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. As protocol demanded, he bent carefully to retrieve the gifts Lucy had left, handling them with the same precision he would use for military equipment. Wrapped craft project felt light in his hands, and the drawing was slightly crinkled from the afternoon breeze. But both items seemed to pulse with the love and care that had gone into their creation. James tucked them carefully inside his tunic, close to his heart, before beginning his measured walk back to the guardhouse. His fellow guards noticed the difference in him immediately. Sergeant Williams, who had been serving alongside James for 2 years, commented on his unusually relaxed demeanor during the debrief. When asked about his day, James simply said it had been eventful, but declined to elaborate. Some experiences, he felt, were too precious to reduce to casual conversation. That evening in his modest flat near the barracks, James carefully unwrapped Lucy's first gift. Inside the bright tissue paper was a small picture frame, decorated, with colorful stickers and containing a photo of Lucy and Tom smiling broadly at the camera. On the back, in a child's careful handwriting assisted by an adult's guidance, were the words, "For our soldier friend. Thank you for protecting us. Love, Lucy and Tom." James placed the frame on his bedside table, where it would be the first thing he saw each morning and the last thing he saw each night. The drawing found a place of honor on his refrigerator, bringing color and life to his previously sparse living space. Over the following days, James discovered that Lucy's impact extended far beyond their personal interaction. Videos of their encounter had been shared widely on social media, touching hearts around the world. News outlets picked up the story, praising both the child's compassion and the guard's graceful response to an unusual situation. But more importantly, James found that his entire approach to his duties had transformed. He still maintained perfect military bearing and followed all protocols, but now his service felt infused with purpose and connection. He began to see the tourists not as obstacles to endure, but as people whose lives he touched, however briefly, through his dedication to duty. Other children, inspired by Lucy's example, began approaching the guards with small gifts and kind words. The interactions were always brief and respectful, but they served to humanize the men behind the uniforms in a way that no official ceremony ever could. James's commanding officers, initially concerned about the breach in traditional protocol, came to recognize that these moments of connection actually enhanced rather than diminished the dignity of the Queen's Guard. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Lucy returned to the palace with her family. This time she brought an entire class of children from her school, all eager to meet the famous soldier friend they had heard so much about. James was not on duty that day, but word reached him through his fellow guards. When James learned of Lucy's visit, he made an unprecedented decision. With his commanding officer's permission, he appeared at the palace gates in his dress uniform, off duty but eager to properly thank the little girl who had changed his life. The reunion was everything James could have hoped for. Lucy's face lit up when she saw him approaching, and she ran to him with the same fearless joy she had shown during their first encounter. This time James was able to return her hug properly, kneeling down to her level and embracing her with the warmth of someone greeting a dear friend. "I knew you were real," Lucy said, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "I knew there was a person inside the uniform." The children from Lucy's class listened with rapt attention as James spoke to them about service, duty, and the importance of treating everyone with kindness and respect. He told them that soldiers were not scary figures to be feared, but protectors who chose to serve their country and its people. But the lesson Lucy had taught him was equally important, that beneath every uniform, behind every role we play in life, beats a human heart capable of connection, compassion, and love. Her fearless display of affection had reminded him that true strength sometimes means allowing others to see our humanity, even in the most formal of circumstances. As James returned to his regular duties in the days that followed, he carried with him the memory of a little girl's hug and the profound truth she had revealed. Service, he now understood, was not about becoming an unfeeling statue, but about choosing to protect and honor the very human connections that make life meaningful. The Queen's Guard would continue their ancient traditions, standing watch over the palace with unwavering dedication. But thanks to one small girl's courage and compassion, they would do so knowing that their true strength lay not in their ability to remain unmoved, but in their capacity to serve with both discipline and heart.